welcome to the Red Mountain Community Church podcast, where you can hear conversations with the people of Red Mountain Community Church as we pursue Jesus together. Each episode highlights what God is doing in someone's life or a specific theme in light of what God has revealed in the Bible. I'm Peter Franson, your fellow seat warmer at Red Mountain Community Church. My co-host today is Dave Emigh, our pastor of family and community. I keep thinking I'm going to say pastor of men's ministry. That's the context I know you in. But no, you really are the pastor of family and community. And I know you and Della are interfacing with different people on family type things. So I keep forgetting that.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those titles that continues to transform. So, because I think there's just a lot of nooks and crannies that they allow me to minister to.
Nice.
So marriage, family, community, kind of as a broader net.
So here we are recording close to the end of January. How was your Christmas holiday and New Year's season? How are your clothes fitting? Mine are tighter for sure. I don't know what happened. Maybe something in the wash.
Well, we had an exciting year because our two oldest kids got married, and I got to perform both of those weddings. So we had a very fun-filled, exciting planning year.
And did you guys see each other during the Christmas season at all, or?
Yes and no, because we had spent so much time with them because they both live here. It was only fair to send them back to the extended family, because we get kind of spoiled, and we have to remember that, like, hey, we can see them anytime.
Yeah.
So if we don't see them on the day, it's really not that big of a deal.
Yeah.
Like we'll be okay.
Yeah.
So, but we figured ways to do that before and after. But yeah, it's been a blessing to get to spend time with our family here in beautiful Arizona and not cold Chicago. So cool. That's nice.
All right. You can't resist the irresistible question. Are you ready, David?
I hope so.
Would you rather take cold showers every day or eat cold meals every day?
Ooh. That's tricky, because cold showers are actually good for your metabolism. So from a health-wise, that's not so bad, and I think you just get used to it. And it's good for your muscles. And then food, if you picked enough things that were tasty that were cold, you could probably do it. So
what's it gonna be?
But I like steaks, and I like warm food. So I think I would go with cold showers.
Yeah. Okay. So I was honestly just trying to give you space to think and not influence your decision, because this is a freaking no-brainer to me. You take the cold showers.
Yeah.
You take the cold showers because you'll learn to endure. It's this one thing. You know what? It would get me in and out of that whole process just faster, more efficiently. You mentioned about the metabolism. I didn't even think about that. I think I heard, though, that there's something maybe about skin or pores that might be good. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
it sounds good.
Yeah, sure. Let's.
and let's be honest. Most of the world probably is taking cold showers, maybe not steamy hot ones. So we're probably a little bit spoiled.
Yeah, we're like overly decadent with all of our warm water.
So yeah, maybe we should just give it a shot.
And some foods, I mean, come on, you got to have it at a certain temperature, or it's all wrong.
Well, some foods you just couldn't eat. I mean, that would...
Yeah, that's true.
You'd die.
I thought you were going to say, like, about the substance. Like, well, some things, they're solid only at certain temperatures, but...
Well, that too. I mean, there's a whole other thing going on there.
Wait a minute. What are you eating regularly in your rhythms of life that if it's not the right temperature, you die, Dave?
Well, like, you can't eat chicken just like cold.
Oh, I think you're allowed to prepare it.
Oh, you can prepare it first, and then you have to put it in the fridge.
I think it can be hot while prepared. I think the question is like eating cold meals.
Yeah, like soup would be nasty.
Yeah.
Like that has to be.
You're like, this is some weird savory cereal.
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, as a reminder, you can message us on Instagram or Facebook with suggestions for fun things that we could do or talk about before the interview. So if that didn't tickle your fancy, that's all on you. You got to send us stuff that you would like to hear instead. But for now, we are going to move things along. Just a little while ago, Dave and I spent some time talking with Preston Zeller about just his experience working through grief through painting. And there's a lot of interesting facets to that. We could only get to some of them, but it yielded, I think, some worthwhile conversation. So here is that for you right now. Well, Preston, thank you so much for being willing to sit down and talk. And just to, for those who are, of course, just starting to listen now, our producer, Arian, just prayed before we got started and reminded me in her prayer in that context that Kyle was just teaching this morning as we record this on January 28th, Sunday afternoon. Kyle just touched on in his teaching today how our future hope changes the way that we grieve. And I just can't help but see some of God's timing in what we're going to talk about with you, Preston. But before we get into that, I would like to just get a brief snapshot of how you would describe your current stage of life, whether that's, you want to talk about that in terms of family composition or work or what you're doing to keep busy, just whatever kind of brief snapshot you want to give.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thank you, Peter and Arian and Dave and just the church for having me on this to just discuss my journey with you guys and all sorts of other things we might get into. But I mean, yeah, I've been married for almost 12 years. I have 3 kids. They're 7, 9, and 10. So oldest 2 girls and my boy, my youngest. And we started coming here, I want to say like April 2023. So we just moved up to the area, and we moved to Arizona from Texas in September 2022. And we kind of coming into here, why I even mentioned that was like we're coming out of somewhat of like a drought for us, like for community. It was really hard to get into a good church community in Texas. We moved there right before COVID, and that made a lot of stuff all weird there.
Oh, yeah.
And then just didn't really connect with any of the churches we went to. So we were going to one in further Southeast Valley in Gilbert, and then started coming here and really started just connecting with, of course, through the men's group and Dave and just different activities here. And I aside from painting and being an artist, I do all sorts of other stuff in the artistic realm as well, and video production. We'll get into that. And then I run a software company. So
okay,
I've been in software and tech for quite a number of years, and it's interesting how the two kind of blend over into each other, and having an artistic outlet, and also the professional world, and of course all that being a missionary field. So that's sort of where I'm at, and just I think on a broader level, just learning to understand how to better use my spiritual gifts, how to support others and what theirs may be, and develop my families and my kids and that kind of thing. And I just see what like the amazing supernatural, the spiritual side of our faith, of course, and what kind of impact we can have on the world beyond just mere words. And what does that look like?
So then what, I might have missed it, what brought you specifically to Arizona and to Mesa? And then also like what specifically led you to check out RMCC and like start getting connected and stuff?
Yeah. So when I was living in Texas, I started a job out here. And this was like beginning of 2022. And when I started it, I'm like, no way I'm moving. And finally, there's a number of things that took place. So it was like, okay, maybe this is, this could make sense to move. Obviously prayed on that. And even with the support that was offered to me to move by my company, it was like, I still don't want to. So it was like, taking that to prayer, of course. But once we came out here, it was like, all right, this is a fresh start, an opportunity to kind of think about the way we're doing things differently.
And you were specifically landing in Mesa?
Well, I was in Gilbert initially because we sold a house there, and I didn't want to just like jump in to buy here. And, the market was also like pretty tumultuous at the time. But so the community right by here, the new one, we happened to look in there, and it was like, we walked in, they're like, you guys need all these things in a house and at a steep discount? I'm like, yeah. So that was one of those things where God's like, here it is.
Yes, yeah, please. Wow.
Yeah. And so we're like, all right, well, we like this spot. And then church-wise, we knew we wanted to be very, very close. So it would be, hey, there's zero excuse not to be involved in going. And so then we tried here one Sunday, and I immediately liked it. It took a few times, get kids turn around.
Sure.
And then my wife started liking it more and getting involved in groups and whatnot. So
great.
That was, honestly, it was just like location, right? Location, proximity.
Wow. Yeah.
But very God driving the doors that way.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your awareness of just how location matters, your proximity to your church matters, and just seeing that as an important priority. Because if you really want to invest in the life of the church and you're living like 30, 40 minutes away, I mean, good gravy. I don't know how you're gonna make that happen.
No, and we had actually had a period in so we've lived in a number of places, but we lived in Washington State for a while, and kind of right on the border of Oregon, so like the Portland metro area. And I went through a period where I was kind of really trying to re-understand my faith, and I got into Hebrew roots a bit, right? And so that's not a typical Sunday church, I guess. So we started going an hour and a half away to a different congregation.
Oh, wow.
And we saw, and this is when our kids were like very, very young, like my boy was 1.
Okay.
So we just saw how unsustainable that was for us too.
Yeah.
It felt very unfair for my wife. It was like, yes, we're like being around other believers, but we're also like putting this crazy taxing commute. And we actually thought about trying to move closer to that one. This is down in Salem, Oregon. And the doors were closed there for reasons we later figured out. So,
okay.
Yeah. So yeah, proximity for sure.
Yeah.
It's been important to us.
So I'm interested just in that perspective, like right at the start of this conversation, I hear you valuing connection to the local church. And of course, that makes me wonder just kind of like your home life as a kid and like how you initially came to faith in Jesus. So I wonder if you could just kind of like give us a little picture of that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a Christian family.
Okay.
I definitely say I'll say the dynamic of my parents is interesting because my dad is 14 years older than my mom.
Oh, okay.
So my dad was born in 43. So it's like coming out of World War II, parents were in depression, so grew up in poverty. And my mom grew up going to Baptist church with the family that was a little more stable there. So that was kind of the makeup of their relationship, and going into, I think, how they raised us. So I think, my mom is a little bit more, took the torch more from a faith perspective. And they're both believers for sure, still are. So they're both still alive. But we made it a point to be involved with our church growing up, and I did VBS and things like that. So, but I think just beyond even growing up, and I'll get back to like my conversion in a moment. But beyond even growing up, I just knew from reading scripture and experience and having done it kind of the opposite way of like, I'm having a really hard time jiving with the theology at the churches I was visiting.
Okay.
And I tried to do like Saturday morning Torah readings with my family and find other people to do that kind of stuff. And I just, it was very, very difficult. Again, some of this was like through, the thick of COVID, but I prayed sinner's prayer when I was pretty young, probably like first or second grade.
Okay.
But just wandered pretty far off into like college. And it wasn't until about a year out of college, that I had like a true conversion experience.
Okay.
It was at a Calvary Chapel men's conference in Southern California. So it was like, 20,000 guys at a huge amphitheater. And they just did like an altar call. And I had that impression before going to that event that well, I prayed this prayer when I was a kid, and I'm good, and just not really realizing there's still something missing. And so there's, of course, a lot more to it than that, but that was definitely the point, like, where I had a sweeping spiritual change go on, like felt the Holy Spirit come about me and like just change my ways, you know? So, yeah.
Okay. So, just in kind of our email correspondences and just some of the hints I picked up from watching the documentary, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, but the sense I get is that a major part of your formation in your walk with the Lord is the result of your brother passing away as an adult, which didn't happen crazy long ago, and it just sounds like it must have been really shaping in some ways for you. So I'm wondering if you could briefly share how he passed away and when that was.
Yeah, so he passed away almost 5 years ago to the day, so February 2019.
Okay.
Drug overdose is the short of it. When I decided to do this documentary, of course I had a lot of the initial like crisis that people do when you go through a loss. And I mean, I think there's losses people experience that are, they're sad, but they're not like profoundly sad for you. Like you go, it doesn't feel like it rocks your world, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's what my brother's was. This something that leaves you in real, true, utter disbelief. So anyways, that was that, but it's like, okay, well, I've always been kind of a really introspective person, and, part of doing, the painting that I did, and also the process of the documentary and the historical aspect of it was like really having to delve into all the different ways that I might understand grief, surely scripturally, and realizing that, how much of the Bible is actually written from people who are in grief and just what they're lamenting. And it's funny because we talked about this in our men's group last week, but just the Psalms, of course, but just the general condition of like humanity throughout thousands of years is like, there's constantly something going wrong. And it's usually, I think, God, lamenting what we're doing, and then we have to like catch up and go, oh yeah, we are in the wrong.
Yeah.
And that sort of continual cycle. And of course that'll, end, but at some point, but I think just, you're looking at, I think everything in life you experience, you go back to scripture and you look at verses or whatever, and you go, oh, I get that now.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of what, I think, part of my grieving experience has been like.
So just to fill in some gaps, because we've kind of been hinting at it and dancing around a little bit, but you made this documentary about your decision to process your grief through painting every day over the course of 1 year. And I've seen the documentary. Anybody that wants can watch it on Amazon Prime Video for free. It won a few awards, so congrats on that. It's called The Art of Grieving, The Art of Grieving. I already picked up earlier, painting was already a part of your life, painting in this style, which is a sort of an abstract style, right? And eventually each of these smaller paintings, which are about maybe the size of a spread hand, right?
About 8 by 10.
Okay, 8 by 10. And then that was eventually assembled into a mosaic around your house. Had you ever done like mosaic before, or this style of painting before? That was already kind of like part of...
So the... a lot of, even before like me getting back into painting, like, and I painted in like high school was probably the last time I did a lot of like physical painting.
Okay.
And that was more like, oh, I'm in fine art courses. I started studying like Cubism at the time, which is like Georges Braque or Picasso.
Okay.
Some works of Picasso. And that's like analytical Cubism was what I really dug into there. But then I've been a musician a long time, and so a lot of what I did in music was I learned how to improvise. So you're playing blues chords or jazz chords or whatever, it was a goal of mine just to be able to like riff on that, which is very much the same idea. If you ever watch someone just like solo any instrument, it's all this like fluidity of thought and what you're feeling at the time, which is partially what makes it so interesting. A 20-minute drum jazz solo is probably the epitome of that. but the style of painting, abstract expressionism is one term, or abstract, intuitive abstract. I gravitated towards that because I'm like, this is just how I like to express myself, where it's like I'm not painting something really literal that is a landscape. I'm not painting a portrait, representational artwork. I really just want something to be a projection of my mind, and then roll with it as it starts to come out on the canvas. And so it kind of like mixed that on an extreme level with doing this sort of like visual journaling through the paintings.
Okay. Was that related, your decision to like, okay, I'm going to specifically enter into grieving through this creative outlet? And you had mentioned that this passing, compared to some other types of experiences that we could have, was not a completely destroy your world type of passing, but still nevertheless something you recognize, I need to process this. So was that the choice to do it through art, an effort to bring emotion out to process it? Or was like, I'm just curious, like, why specifically this? You're like, I think this will help me kind of process what I'm thinking or grieving.
Well, and we talk about this in the documentary too, or Lindsay does, but I think the difficult thing about grief that some parts of Scripture do really well is it's difficult to articulate, and so even like I write quite a bit, and even I feel like for myself, trying to write it out as best as I could probably ever do it, it's not good enough. And for me, I'm such a visual person that being able to express the intricacies of grief through a visual medium gives more potency to what I'm feeling, as opposed to just listing out a ton of words that may describe how I'm feeling. Yeah. So, and then like to take, and I had done some. I kind of talked about this at one point, but I did a bunch of bigger pieces leading up to this decision right after my brother's passing, where it was like these, and I love bigger canvases, overall working on them, but they're more of a process, right? It's like these these emotions of grief are coming at you so fast. I can't just like wait and go, okay, I'm going to do another pass of this big canvas. I'm like, I need to do a lot more than just like this big canvas. So that's part of what led up to it, is getting through that sort of rapid iteration.
Okay.
So was there, Preston, as you developed one like each day as an artist, did that feel constricting? Because like in one way you're saying like there's this fluid processing of grief where it's like, okay, I have this canvas for today. But like, did you find it hard being inspired to like have your emotions be on that canvas? And then what if it was like, well, I've got 7 I could do today, but I have to like chill out because I have 365 days to do this. Like, and then, yeah.
No, that's a good question. I would typically go and work on a bigger canvas after that. I think there were some times that I did flow to a different canvas, another smaller piece, but I kept those kind of separate. But like overall, I think the act of just sitting down and working through your emotions to go from like, oh, I'm in some other mode that's not being creative, and now I'm going to put the paint on the canvas. It sometimes felt like I need to get into this, right? It's not just like, I couldn't just break away from whatever I was doing in the moment and be like, I feel like grieving right now, and that means I'm going to go paint. It's just like I knew there was stuff stuck back in there. And I think the other thing to it being every day was that I also and sharing all these, I wasn't painting them to be like, this is going to end up in someone's house, or it's going to end up in a museum, or whatever the case. Like, I didn't really care aesthetically if they were pleasing or not. And some of them, it's funny because I've sold prints and stuff. Some of them people bought, and I'm like, I don't know why you bought that. It's not, it wasn't one that I particularly liked, but I look back on it and I'm like, I was going through something in that time that made me paint that. And I'm glad I did. Mm-hmm. It's not something I'd probably paint again, but that's part of the exercise is you're tapping in all these feelings and things of that nature that you may otherwise push down or may come out in some other way.
So is that like one of the counselors in the, I think, video said grief needs to find a home? Uh-huh. Would you say that was kind of like, instead of writing it out, it was like the canvas was the home where I wanted that grief expression?
Yeah, most definitely. And I think, there's other aspects of it too. Like I spent a lot of time, it wasn't just painting it, right? Danielle actually kind of comments on this at one point early on, but once I was done painting it, I had to go through process. Okay, it dried, now I have to finish it. And then I'm actually doing these like super high quality archival scans of them because I've done so many other kind of side projects with them. I'm doing some like AI art stuff with them right now, just because there's more to it than just even like what's in the documentary. There's more things I'm kind of like doing to help myself understand like that sort of time period. Yeah.
So what was it like for you to commit to that disciplined process of, not just painting? It sounds like that actually fit into some of your normal rhythms, but you're also, when I watched the documentary, I couldn't quite discern. I was like, now how much of this was filmed throughout the year, and then how much of some of these interstitial things are really just editing and filming that was done after the year was done? So how much of the filming process was actually kind of invading life during that year?
Not much of it, really. Yeah, most of it was centered around afterwards. Okay. And so of course like the whole process of like unboxing and hanging the mosaic, that's all after. Sure. It's very shortly after. Yeah. And then a lot of the other clips happened in the year after. I intentionally didn't want to sort of muddy it up with all the other things. Now there's about 280 individual ones that are filmed. Of course, there's only so much I could do with all those. But yeah, I didn't want to distract it. It was kind of exhausting enough.
Yeah.
And it was also not like, I think a typical film, maybe you would say, okay, we're going to go create a plan, a marketing plan, a budget. We're going to go raise money, all this kind of stuff. And then we're going to get a crew to film it. Like, I didn't have any of that. Not to mention, again, this was like all during 2020. So I started this project 2019, and then it was all through that first year of craziness. So, getting resources for anything was just so bizarre.
Yeah.
And that was part of like there's a lot of things I really had to, leave up to God and faith to even say, is this going to get done? What's it going to look like?
Yeah.
I just didn't know. And so some of the story, even of how that came about, was pretty crazy.
So, in watching the documentary, it's made for general audiences. Mm-hmm. It's not specifically for a Christian audience, and you're not presuming that people are going to be coming at it from that perspective. But now we can dig into that. And so sure. I'd love to hear what kinds of things you were processing or going through in terms of your relationship with God, your view of God, your view of God's presence and activity in the world and your life, as you were just going through these various stages of grief. And we can broaden this out, it doesn't have to be specific to while you were painting. I just want to talk about your grief in general, really, and what kinds of things you were processing, praying through, and how do you think God was maybe meeting you and working throughout that time?
Yeah, that's a great, very full question.
Yeah, there's a lot to it, so you can take that wherever you want.
Well, I think first off, like the decision to even do the documentary, and again, I kind of touch on it there, where I actually came down to I was in Sedona at the time, or I came down to visit my parents in Phoenix. This is right around that time period where it was like, I feel like I'm gonna go cuckoo if I don't do something about my life. There's too much going on at work, dealing with grief. I don't think I'm dealing with grief well. And I tried going to like different groups and all this stuff, but I'm like, nothing's quite hitting home on what feels like I'm making progress enough on. But so I came down and we took like a day trip to Sedona, came back. And during that time, I think we took like a Jeep ride down out, and, they take you in the boondocks of Sedona. And I was praying partially during that time. It was just like, I need to get out and quiet and, hear God. And so there are the two things I mention in the documentary, the I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to do this crazy painting. That was feel like a download from God for sure. Again, it's like some of these things, I don't mention them in the documentary because I knew part of what I wanted to accomplish in the documentary is bring people into this story that is not like an overtly spiritual story. Yeah. Just because I wanted to draw people into and breadcrumb them. Yeah. And I've been involved in making enough projects where it's just people are people and the world's like gonna judge things one way or the other. And that's actually why as I go through, if I skip through to like post-production, that's where a lot more of the sort of like reflective healing side, the spiritual healing side came. And I'll say that because, of course, during the paintings, it's like, my wife's supporting me through this. It's sort of it's an emotionally draining journey. And yes, we still like convened in prayer and all that kind of stuff. But when I sat down to edit it, I actually took a sabbatical from my normal career stuff. And I spent like full-time plus just editing. And during that time, you're like, what? You're constantly asking yourself as an editor, even though you have and I worked with a Emmy award-winning story producer, and we kind of mapped this out with the 3-act structure and all that kind of stuff. What is going to tell this story in a way that reflects me, but also kind of maximizes the sort of like messaging and exposure. So the history section was where I was kind of able to tie some of that together. So you'll notice there's like C.S. Lewis in there. There's Vanitas paintings that talk about Job. Of course, talk about like it's fast paced, right? But it actually culminates in basically saying that Christ is the most covered, talked about, or depicted death in any kind of art form. Yeah, and it doesn't have like this long space to let that moment breathe because it's sort of just presenting this factual
it's like a subtle
stuff.
Seed that's dropped throughout, which that's cool.
Yeah, and that's partially the point. That's why I started out with the Book of the Dead, because I know I want the pagan who may actually believe in the Book of the Dead to be like, yeah, I get that, and then to go to Job and be like, what's that about? And then get to C.S. Lewis doing the surgeon metaphor, and then get to the reference of Christ and be like, that is interesting. This Jesus character is the most depicted one. Why is that? So it's that kind of stuff where I'm like, it's supposed to be like a very subtle like gospel seed to people, and that I'm also like as someone that, and people who know me especially, like my whole year of sharing these photos or sharing the artwork through my Instagram and stuff, they all had a Bible verse attached to them. So people.
Wait, was that the same year that you were painting them? You're talking about? Okay.
So every single one had a Bible verse attached to it, and I started getting people who drop like different other verses. So they got people who kind of followed that progress. They got to know who I was, and so and that's the thing to me. It never really felt like, hey, I want to be overly preachy about this. And maybe there will be a time and a place for that, but there's also the bridge of just knowing that like there are so many people where if you approach it just from a purely Christ-centered lens, that it's kind of off-putting. And so I kind of like backdoor that.
Yeah.
And I think maybe some of that comes from like my professional life of like, people are going to judge me by my character. If I just come into a meeting and be like, y'all need Jesus to start the meeting, they're going to be like, no, know? Anyways, so there was a lot in there.
Yeah. So it sounds like a lot of the project in your mind was ultimately about sharing or something that would ultimately make people curious about Jesus as they are considering death. But now what about you? Like in your grieving process, as you were doing this, what kinds of things were you thinking about in terms of who God is? Was there any conflict or change in your thoughts about who God is and his relationship to you in light of what you were grieving?
Part of the way I think about that is like, okay, what kind of gifts do I have? I mean, I think, and I've revisited that quite a bit. There's a really good book called Courage and Calling.
Okay.
That kind of talks about how, like, where your gifts, that take place that talked about in, I forget which book in the New Testament it is, but your spiritual gifts. Corinthians. Okay. So thinking about those, but then also thinking about like these talents that I do have, like what is the yield of those, I guess. And I've done, I've been in like church worship before, and I've done different like media art stuff. And for some reason I just connect with people. Right. And so I'm like, okay, well, through this process, I'm going, okay, God, how do you want me to sort of share my story in a way that is going to draw people ultimately to you? And part of that is through the artistry. And so let me explain what I mean by that. There's, so many fantastic artists in this world and people who develop creativity. And I think it's easy to sort of discount that, like, creativity always comes from a creator. And even if you think about, like, okay, let's take Bob Ross, because most people know who that is. But if you look at a painting of Bob Ross that he does, you look at the painting and you go, wow, that's a gift. Why is that a gift? And you go, all he's doing is recreating something else that you actually probably find a lot more beautiful. What created that?
Yeah.
And so it's just this idea of like creating creativity and what a creative mind is. And that pointing back to our creator, to God, and to hopefully like stir that up in people. It's like stirring the conversation through, again, these kind of like these breadcrumbs. And I think for me, when I'm creating, that is part of how I feel closeness with God, because I know who I was created to be, but that's also a very distinct characteristic of God. Is that he created us, of course, created, the world and everything in it. And it's like, why couldn't we glorify him through that? And that's something I think I continue to think about, is how am I using my painting to connect with my relationship to Christ and who Yahweh is, and just really trying to, and sharing that with other people. So, and that's why actually I sent this painting to Dave the other day that I finished, that was like sort of my interpretation of the burning bush. And just to sum that all up, because I know I can talk, but to sum that all up, painting and being creative in general, this is one of the best ways I think about it. What is the universal language for you bring a child into a restaurant, what are they going to give the child?
Crayons.
Crayons. They're going to give them crayons.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter where they're from. You could be on the other side of the world. They're going to give them something to be creative with.
Yeah.
They don't do that with adults. Here's your menu. Go tell us what you want, and then pay us your money, right? But we're all kind of like inherently creative. And so when you get someone into a creative mindset, it changes things. And it's been one of the huge blessings of this documentary has been people who watch it don't consider themselves creative and then go paint. And when you're in a creative mode, it does something different to your brain that breaks you out of just like the very like logical and overly rhetorical way that I think people can tend to think about stuff versus going, why can't I do this? Why is this satisfying? Why does this feel good to me? And perhaps give you an opening for like God to actually like speak to you in a way that you wouldn't be open to otherwise.
So at this point now, on the other side of having produced and released this documentary, and having been through this process of grieving, which I would imagine just in ripples is going to continue in different ways throughout your life, what do you think the Lord might be doing in your life right now? And has your documentary or the experience that you had opened up any doors in terms of your conversations with people about grief and healing?
Well, I mean, so the documentary's been out for about a year and a half, and it just kind of continues to get picked up in different places. Like I think 2 or 3 months ago, some Dutch Enlightenment type of like streaming platform picked it up.
Okay.
And so it's kind of getting into these like weird secular places that like, again, where those breadcrumbs get placed. But I've been thinking a lot about, because I took a break from like posting on like social media so much. I just got so sick of social media. I was posting on it so much. For the documentary, I finished like a PR run like March last year. So I'm just like, take a step back going, okay, what is next, right? And that was kind of actually around the time we started going here. And I'm like, I just want to focus on like my faith and being involved in the church and meeting new people and see where that actually takes me.
Great.
Which I think even that we're having this conversation is kind of a testament to that. And I think as you and I were talking about at lunch, Dave, recently, is kind of just figuring out where does the story and my skill set, like how does that continue to perpetuate the sharing of the gospel and ultimately like that directness. I do think there's a time and a place for the breadcrumb approach, and then there's a time and a place to just be like, hey, Jesus loves you, and he wants to know you. Yeah. What do you say? Like, let's do this. What are you waiting for? And I've had those conversations too, and so I'm just thinking about where is that going to take me, and I think the one other thing I'd add is that the great thing about the documentary is that people have come to me and they've like confided me more about what they're experiencing, and it inevitably turns into some sort of like spiritual conversation, and that in and of itself opens the door to be like, okay, where are you at with that? You know? And sometimes it's there, I feel like, to, share the gospel more. And sometimes it's like, it's just not. But that is a very interesting foray into talking about the gospel, because I think if people don't already, once they experience a profound loss in their life, from death specifically, then they start to go, wait a second, where's that person going? Where am I going? Yeah. What's happening here? The mortality question comes into play. Yeah. And that's a very hard answer to actually get when you say, I subscribe to 5 different religions. It doesn't work. Yeah. So what is it? Yeah.
Preston, as a husband and as a father, your family had like a front row seat for all of this. What kind of conversations have you guys got into around like grieving and the impact of art in that. And, because you said like, hey, we always give kids crayons, but it's like, do we see that as a way, right? And so as your kids were watching you paint, or your wife, what kind of conversations did that develop for you guys as a family around grief, around faith, around creativity, any of those?
Yeah. Well, so the house that the documentary is filmed at, so, I had it was actually a dining room that I just like tore everything out and turned it into a studio, right? So it was just there all the time. And it was chaos because I shared it with my kids. Basically, they'd go in, they'd do stuff, and so that kind of actually brought to mind, like, if you were able to make art like a central sort of component to a child's lifestyle, I don't see them ever stop doing it. Why would they? Because I didn't have to prompt them to go make stuff. They would just go make stuff all the time. And they still do that to this day. And so, like, when we moved here, it was, okay, well, how am I going to make a new space for that? And even there's been times where, like, I have a kid who's super frustrated. They're very emotional. And I'm like, can you draw for me how you're feeling right now? And they'll go do it. And, you're like, okay, that's pretty dark, but I'll take it. This, I don't know how you would describe this. But even their way of communicating with myself, I find oftentimes they draw pictures. They, even at the age they're at now, I mean, of course they're better at explaining how they feel. But I think in general, and this goes back to some of the, part of the impetus of the documentary too, is just this, people don't talk about it. Even in the church, I think it's hard for people to talk about it sometimes, but especially in culture, I think it kind of goes back to that, like, people can be overly cavalier about life, the whole YOLO movement and all that kind of stuff. Or they just don't want to think about that they're ever going to die. There's this sense of, well, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna live a long life, and I'm gonna live as hard as I can until then. And so for our family, because of just being immersed in it as they were, it's just normal for us to talk about death and talk about afterlife and talk about, now that they're a little older, talk about what do other people think about this kind of idea, because they're in public school, so they hear more kids talk about all sorts of stuff. But the sort of ironic thing to me is a lot of platforms have labeled the documentary as being 16 and over. Because there's a drug reference, talks about death. There's some strange paintings in there, and so my kids have seen it so many times, and I'm like, but they don't. They just look at it as being part of, like, what we've gone through. And I think that was the other thing too. I kind of mentioned in the doc as well, is like, there's something sort of traumatic that happens in the family, and Kyle even touched on this today, is like the shame that you can feel from all this stuff, and that this was even a really controversial subject for my family to some degree because of the way my brother died. Like, people don't want to, like, put on a front page in the newspaper when someone passes from something that's not honorable. Of course, if they die saving someone in a fire, you're going to shout that from the rooftop. But anything else that's not culturally sort of looked upon in a good way is really tough. So it's just, we've had a lot more of these conversations in our household, and trying to keep it all, centered back to, like, okay, what has Christ done for us? And the mere fact that they are even that much more aware of death and the ramifications of that actually highlights the work of Christ more and the resurrection. So you're like, okay, well, you've seen, like, some of the impact of, like, the emotionality of death and us who die because we've actually done all these things to, like, sully our bodies or whatever, and we're just living a corrupt world. Okay, well, it takes, the perfection of Christ and his death, like, doesn't make sense willingly. anyways.
Well, thanks for that, Dave. This has been great. Do you have anything else that you wanted to touch on?
Well, Arian and I were talking earlier. I think the $1 million question is like, where's that mural now? Because like,
the mosaic.
The mosaic.
Yeah.
I mean, that was like an epic. I mean, just getting that lift in the house, I was like, please Jesus, just let me get in. So I mean, you got it backlit and like, I mean, that whole thing. I was like, man, what a project. And like, it was so cool and so beautiful. Like, it was kind of like just the culmination of everything. And then I was like, well, they don't live in that house anymore. Like, was that like, do you leave that? Do you like, are those all in like boxes in the garage? Like, you know, and so.
No, it's funny you say that, because when we had our pictures taken to sell our house.
Were they up?
Oh, I think they're still on there now.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was up. So it's like just scrolling through, and it was so normal to me. But you would you'd see this thing and be like, "Well, what the heck is that?" But yeah, to answer your question, it's in boxes. The goal of it actually initially was to have it be in a public exhibition, so like be able to show the mosaic, be able to show the light show, and then be able to actually see the documentary. And so the goal from there is, and this is still one of the goals, like I don't actually consider the documentary done yet because it hasn't been shown publicly. So my goal is to get it shown publicly and then actually film that as like an addendum. So where it ends now is to have like 4 years later. Because that's partially what makes documentaries so interesting, right? Is the time, the span of time it covers. And then actually have the ability to get people's responses in a greater way. But I will say, when people would come to like an AC person or whatever, just someone that would come to the house, it was really cool to see their reaction, and then it would just start a conversation.
Oh, sure.
And that was one of the cooler things about it, that I realized that, you could look at it in one sense, someone might be like, I don't know what this is. And then once you kind of describe the essence of it being about grief and growing around grief, someone would go like every time, oh, I lost so-and-so. Sometimes it was like a week prior.
Oh boy.
And not every time, but oftentimes it would lead into a discussion of spirituality. And so it's in this bizarre way that you don't think it's going to like end up in a conversation about Christ, but it does, just because, again, I think going back to the you're creating for the right reasons, and someone finds interest in it, and then they ask you about it, and then the story behind it evolves into, okay, but it's really about this other thing, which is Christ. And some people go, I'm on the same wavelength, and some people are like, tell me more. So yeah.
Well, this has been great. I appreciate just like hearing about the way that the Lord is using specifically your creative outlets and your transparency, and so it'll be neat to get an update at some point, whether it's related to this documentary or something else, that you've kind of like latched onto as something that the Lord seems to be using. And even more than that, it'll just be great as everyone gets to know you more, as you get more connected in the church here, as you've already been. And it just sounds like you mentioned that earlier, but it sounds like that's maybe a really valuable next step that he'll have for you, and it's always neat to see what comes of that. So thank you for sharing this snapshot, this little time capsule of your walk with the Lord with us right now.
Oh, thanks, Peter, and thanks, Dave. Yeah.
Is there a website if people wanted to go to check out? I know Peter
The Art of Grieving. Yeah, The Art of Grieving.
But is it just theartofgrieving.com?
It's theartofgrievingfilm.com.
Okay.
Yeah, and there you can see all the, anywhere it's streaming. Some people go on Prime's the most common one, but some people go to Apple TV and other random places that it's playing. But yeah, you can see where it's playing there, and
cool.
Sign up for like newsletter stuff and whatnot.
Okay.
So yeah,
Sweet.
Cool. Great. Well, thanks again, Preston.
cool. Thank you guys.
You're welcome.
Well, Dave, what stood out to you? If there's something that, or should I start? Because there was hesitancy before we started recording.
Bader tried to get me organized, but he doesn't realize I just like shooting from the hip. So he was like, "Are we ready or are we not ready?"
I can say something first, or you can go. What do you think?
I think there was many things. I think that, like we had talked about, the podcast could have been much longer.
Yeah,
but I really liked just the simplicity of the little breadcrumbs or seeds of the gospel that were planted throughout the documentary intentionally.
Mm-hmm.
But when you watch it, it's not like in your face. But the more you think about it, you can see Preston's heart when you hear him talk, his desire to use art as a way to bring people to the gospel and a greater understanding of how to process grief. So
yeah,
I think that's what stood out to me probably the most.
Yeah. And I think for me, what struck you as kind of a novel idea is something that I've been processing for years as well, is the idea of our creativity ultimately being credited to our creator.
Yeah.
He is, you could either word it saying he's the creator of creativity, or he imparts what is part of his eternal self, being the creator. He imparts a form of that. But at the same time, we have to give glory to the creator, to our creator, because all that we can really do is rearrange other ideas that we've picked up somewhere else.
Sure.
Yahweh is the one that actually creates out of nothing.
Right.
It's not some pre-existing, whatever. It's like, here, this is a brand absolutely new thing.
It's kind of like what Preston said when you see somebody do a painting, you're like, well, that's beautiful. But the original that the painting is based off of a landscape is actually more brilliant, but that comes from the creator.
Yeah. My dad said to me once that science fiction, it's all just kind of like rearranging things that have already been, it's like, you take a lizard and a man, you got a lizard man, you take, or whatever the weird concept is, you're just moving stuff around, and so, it is interesting. But I think also what we see in his situation is an example of how the arts, and whether that's, abstract art like he was doing, or whether that's film or music or anything creative, how it can strike us a different way and open up opportunities to think and talk about things that we are feeling that aren't going to come up in another way. I think that, I think a lot of us experience this after watching a movie. On the drive home, we end up talking about it because it stirred something in us and we felt something, and so we want to talk about that. And I think that there are all these great springboards that we could, if we wanted to, take advantage of, whether we are artistic ourselves or not, or we're just the observers, the consumers of art. There are these springboards in our artistic experiences in entertainment that are ready and waiting for us to take advantage of, to both process truths ourselves, to question things presented that are not true, and to start really valuable conversations.
Absolutely.
And I see that in Preston's story, the ability to use art to start those fantastic conversations that he talked about having with people, and just the reminder that, we don't have to be abstract artists or filmmakers or musicians or whatever. We still interact with art and entertainment, and as believers, we have so many opportunities with non-believers, with other believers, to use those as just really rich springboards.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, that is it, I think, for this episode of the Red Mountain Community Church podcast. I want to thank Arian, our producer, for all that she does behind the scenes to help line up guests and make it all happen, and organizing the show. Also, thanks to the pastors who recommend and select each of our guests. You can follow Red Mountain Community Church on Instagram and Facebook, where you can also leave us comments and suggestions to help make the show better. Also, be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening so you don't miss out on the next episode. And if by some some weird chance you want more of me blabbing on topics relevant to Christian geeks, you can check out my personal weekly show, the Christian Geek Central podcast. But in the meantime, I'm Peter Franson. That's when you say, I'm
Dave.
Okay. You don't want to say your last name? He's Dave Emigh. I don't know if you guys knew that. We should have rehearsed this. All right. Thanks for listening. See you on Sunday.
We can redo that part if you want.
No. That's what makes it beautiful.